Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to the Nancy Boys channel. And apologies in advance. I feel like I always start my videos with an apology, but it's been a bit of a strange few weeks. There's been so many releases that frankly I've not been able to keep up. And I've been and seen two of the new releases tonight, and I just thought, wouldn't it be easier just to do a quick wrap-up video of the four main movies that I've seen over the past few weeks. It's been a very strange start to the year. I think we've actually had some really good films in January, which is very unusual. Like typically horror films that come out in January are kind of discarded there and just to get rid of them, and not expected that much. But with The Bone Temple and The Housemaid, I was quite pleasantly surprised. And now I feel like the last few weeks we've definitely entered into a much more average horror movie territory, which kind of leads me on to the three movies we're going to talk about today. So we'll start with a bit of an old favourite, which is The Strangers trilogy, which I've reviewed the first two of over the past 2 years, and I saw Strangers Chapter 3 tonight. And this is a bit of a surprise. And look, I'm not going to pretend that The Strangers Chapter 3 is good. It is a bad movie. But in my opinion, Strangers Chapter 1 and 2 were so bad that actually I was not pleasantly surprised, because it wasn't necessarily pleasant, but I didn't think Strangers Chapter 3 was as bad as those first two movies. So that in itself is a bit of a badge of honour, because it didn't get progressively worse. I do think the second one is the worst one. It's just an extended chase sequence. The first one is just a weird remake of the original Strangers. The third one had, I don't know, I think I can't say that it had good moments. I can't call out things that were amazing about it. What I would say is that I wasn't actively annoyed and screaming at the screen as much as I was in those first two. There were still some logic choices here. The characters are still really weird, and I think, it sort of struck me when I was watching it that the thing about these films is they take themselves so damn seriously, and they're so bad. And I think that's kind of what is like the perfect ingredient for what makes them so unusually awful, because there's just not a modicum of a sense of humour, and yet the scripts are quite clunky. The characters and the people don't act like real people would, and there's just a lot of weird, almost philosophical dialogue in this that doesn't really go anywhere, and a lot of sort of strangeness. But I would say, actually, the last hour of this film has some okay moments. It's quite brutal. It's sort of brutal in the way that maybe the first Strangers 2008 was, almost stripped back from emotion and actually quite nasty and mean-spirited, which can kind of go either way. But at least it was something, and it inspired some sort of emotion in me of actually some of the deaths were quite hard to watch. And there's a sequence in around the middle of the film which was just icily cold. The way it was shot, I thought, was quite brutal. And it was kind of interesting to walk away from something from one of these movies. And actually, did I quite enjoy the ending? Yeah, I suppose I did. I feel like Madeline Petch, the Maya character, sort of finally came into her own and did something interesting. But look, none of these films are good. I still think the whole thing is very strange. Still feel like Rennie Harlin was trolling us by even making these. I would love to actually understand what he was going for and whether he's in on the joke, because the whole thing has been a real strange waste of time. With that said, I'm going to give Strangers Chapter 3 a very generous 4 out of 10. That's marginally more than I gave the others. And again, I'm not saying this film is good. I just don't think it was as bad as those first two, which I really wasn't expecting. Secondly, we move on to a film called Whistle. This is a horror film directed by Corin Hardy, who I believe previously directed at least one of the Nun franchise. And this is a very sort of Final Destination-esque take on those kind of, I don't know what to call them. They're sort of like talisman-based horror movies. So you've got Ouija, you've got Tarot, and then you have Whistle. Personally, I think Whistle is the best of those three. They're not linked in any way, I don't believe, in terms of like production or directors, but thematically, it's very, very similar. Like you take some sort of ancient item or some sort of cursed object, and then sort of bring about a plot from it. And the synopsis is broadly that this whistle, when you blow it, kind of summons your death, and you end up having the death that you were supposed to have a little bit earlier than you'd planned. So there's some Final Destination-esque stuff in there. It's very, very by the numbers. I think in terms of plot beats, we've seen this time and time again. Part of me would hope to think that the director knows that and is sort of playing with it. because the archetypes, the kind of the setup, there's always a character with a tragic backstory, new girl in town, a mysterious kind of person explaining the kind of the mythos of it, and then the characters figuring out how they're going to stop it from happening. Some really quite good gnarly deaths. I'm not quite sure that it fully worked. I think this whole thing of you're supposed to get the death that you're supposed to have could have played out slightly more visually. There were times I just think I don't really know what that was supposed to represent, and it could have been a bit more fleshed out. But there is a really good death scene in this that I think in years to come, this film probably won't be hugely remembered, but that death scene is one of the ones that will appear on lists. And people will go, oh, I don't remember Whistle, but that's great. Or, I didn't know that's where that death scene came from. So for that reason alone, it's worth a watch. I really enjoyed the central romance. You don't get many lesbian romances, although there's been a few actually in the last few years, which is actually quite nice to see. Like a bit of lesbian representation is very, very rare. I really liked Daphne Keane and Sophie Nélisse in this. They played sort of that couple and the kind of the two main protagonists. Sophie Nélisse in particular, I just thought she had something really kind of enigmatic about her, and I would love to see her in some other stuff. And I think those performances did slightly elevate it. I think it did fall into that annoying trap of having just awful horror characters, and if you know me by now, you know that's one of my most hated horror tropes, is just characters being horrible to each other. When I just don't think, I think it's just lazy writing and never really adds anything. So again, I don't think it's a good movie in that respect, but do I think it's a solid Friday night popcorn movie? Absolutely. I think it's worth a watch. I kind of had fun with it. I think it was way too long. It needed a bit of an edit. I think those death scenes could have popped a bit more, but ultimately I had a pretty good time. I'll probably never think about it again. And that was a good solid 6 out of 10 for me. And then I might as well just mention, I saw Primate a few weeks ago as well. And as I'm here and I'm giving a bit of a roundup, Primate, probably quite similar sort of critique to Whistle, in that the beats of that movie are very, very predictable. Like you kind of know exactly how it's going to play out, almost from the get-go. Like you just know what's going to happen to certain characters, where it's going to kind of end up. The ending is very, very Hollywood. But a bit like Whistle, it was very solidly done, actually, like very well put together, quite tense. Like when you're watching it, it's probably a bit like going on a ghost train. Like you have fun, like you scream and you kind of jump at the appropriate moments, and then you get off the ride and you go home and you never really think about it again. I would say that I almost forgot about Primate as soon as I left the cinema. I can barely remember the characters' names. I remember some of the death scenes. It's, again, really, really fun, solid movie. Probably, again, a 6 out of 10. But again, like one that is not going to be a classic, but it's kind of a well-made one. So those are kind of my kind of wrap-ups of those last 3 major horror releases that we've had. There's a ton more coming. I will say that I saw Send Help at the weekend. It's not strictly a horror, but I loved it. And I think it's worth a recommendation here that I thought that was really solidly done. It's a Sam Raimi movie with Rachel McAdams. Great cast, really, really fun plot. Doesn't ever really go in a predictable direction, unlike some of these films. So of all the films I've seen, probably the non-horror, because I think it's more of a thriller, is probably the one I would recommend the most. But there's some fun in there. There's some good stuff. I think The Strangers Chapter 3, I kind of had to see it to round it out, but that whole thing is very, very strange, and I don't really understand what happened there. I don't even know if really it's been a success. My understanding is it hasn't, and that's why they've rush released them, because that whole trilogy has only taken a year and a half to go out. I think it was May 2024 when Chapter 1 came out. Anyway, as I said, loads coming up. There are literally horror films almost every weekend at the moment, it feels. I feel like we're going to have another sort of 2025 situation where we're going to suddenly get to May or June and there's going to be nothing left because everything's coming out. So you've got Ready or Not 2, Scream 7, and The Bride, the new sort of Dracula movie, and then a ton of stuff's kind of peppered throughout the year. So it's going to be a good year, but off to a very strange start. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.